By 1943, German intelligence in occupied France had placed a bounty of 5 million francs on the head of a single Allied operative, one of the largest rewards the Gestapo offered for any individual resistance figure during the entire occupation. They knew her only by a code name, the White Mouse. They knew she had repeatedly slipped through their checkpoints, evaded capture during multiple close encounters, and helped coordinate resistance operations across an enormous stretch of occupied territory. What they did not fully appreciate, even as they hunted her relentlessly, was that this elusive operative had, on at least one documented occasion, killed an enemy soldier with her bare hands to protect the secrecy of her mission.
Her name was Nancy Wake, and by the time the Second World War ended, she had become one of the most decorated Allied servicewomen of the entire conflict, a New Zealand-born adventurer turned resistance organizer, whose wartime exploits reads less like conventional military history and more like an account almost too extraordinary to be entirely believed, except that virtually every detail of it is thoroughly documented. Nancy Wake was born in New Zealand in 1912 and raised primarily in Australia, and her path toward the extraordinary wartime career that lay ahead of her began not with any early military training, but with a spirit of restless independence that led her as a young woman to leave Australia and travel extensively through Europe and the United States, eventually settling into a career as a journalist based in Paris during the 1930s. It was during this period, working as a journalist in Europe, that Wake gained first-hand exposure to the rise of Nazi Germany, including reportedly witnessing, during a reporting trip to Vienna, the treatment of Jewish citizens under the escalating anti-Semitic policies of the Nazi regime. An experience that appears to have profoundly shaped her personal, deeply held opposition to fascism years before the outbreak of the war that would eventually consume much of Europe. This early direct persecution to Nazi persecution, occurring well before most of the wider world had fully grasped the scale of what Nazi ideology would ultimately produce, gave Wake a genuine, personal motivation that would later prove central to understanding her extraordinary willingness to accept the enormous risks her wartime activities would eventually require. Wake married a wealthy French industrialist in 1939. Shortly before the outbreak of the war, and the couple settled in Marseille, a city that would soon find itself at the center of a complex, dangerous web of resistance activity, following France's defeat and occupation by German forces the following year. Rather than retreating into the relatively comfortable, protected existence her marriage and social position might otherwise have afforded her, Wake instead became increasingly involved in the developing French resistance movement, initially working to help Allied airmen and other individuals evade capture by German authorities. Using her particular access to resources, transportation, and social connections to support an escape network that helped move endangered individuals out of occupied France and toward neutral territory. This early resistance work proved genuinely dangerous, and Wake's increasingly active role within these escape networks eventually brought her to the direct attention of German and collaborationist French security forces, who began actively investigating and pursuing the individual responsible for what had become one of the more effective escape operations functioning within occupied southern France. It was during this period that Wake acquired the code name that would follow her for the remainder of the war and become permanently associated with her historical legacy, the White Mouse. A nickname German intelligence services applied to her specifically because of her demonstrated, repeated ability to evade capture and slip away from checkpoints and surveillance operations that had been specifically established in an effort to identify and apprehend her. As German pursuit of her intensified and her position within occupied France grew increasingly precarious, Wake made the difficult decision to attempt to flee France entirely, eventually making her way, after a genuinely arduous and dangerous journey involving multiple attempts, various border crossings, and considerable personal risk, to Britain, where her demonstrated resistance experience and evident capability brought her to the attention of British intelligence services, then actively seeking to recruit and train capable operatives for deployment back into occupied France. Wake was recruited into the Special Operations Executive, a British organization specifically established to conduct and coordinate irregular warfare, sabotage, and resistance support operations across occupied Europe. An organization that, during this period of the war, was increasingly recognizing the genuine strategic and operational value that women could bring to resistance and intelligence work. Given that female operatives could often move through occupied territory and pass through German checkpoints with somewhat less immediate suspicion than male operatives of comparable age. A tactical reality that made women like Wake genuinely valuable operational assets, rather than simply a symbolic inclusion within what remained, in most other respects, a heavily male-dominated wartime intelligence and military establishment. Wake underwent extensive Special Operations Executive training, covering a demanding range of skills including weapons handling, unarmed combat, sabotage techniques, parachute training, and the various clandestine tradecraft skills that operatives being prepared for deployment into occupied territory would need to master. Wake reportedly excelled throughout this demanding training program, developing a reputation among her instructors and fellow trainees as an exceptionally capable, determined operative whose combination of genuine courage, physical capability, and evident personal motivation made her one of the more promising candidates being prepared for eventual deployment back into occupied France. In April 1944, in the crucial months leading up to the Allied invasion of Normandy, Wake was parachuted back into occupied France as part of a small Special Operations Executive team tasked with organizing, training, and coordinating French resistance fighters, known as the Maquis. Operating within a specific region of central France, work that would prove directly relevant to the broader Allied strategic effort to disrupt German military capability and troop movements in the critical period surrounding the eventual D-Day landings. Wake's specific responsibilities within this operation included coordinating the distribution of weapons, supplies, and funding parachuted into the region by Allied aircraft, organizing and training a substantial force of resistance fighters, eventually numbering in the thousands, and helping coordinate sabotage operations targeting German infrastructure and lines of communication throughout the region. Work that required her to move constantly between various resistance groups scattered across a considerable stretch of rural French territory, maintaining operational security and effective coordination, despite the constant, genuine risk of German discovery and capture. It was during this period of operation, deep within occupied France, that Wake's wartime experience produced one of the most genuinely striking, well-documented incidents of her entire service record. According to Wake's own later accounts, corroborated by fellow resistance operatives who were present, during a raid on a German facility, Wake found herself in a situation where a German sentry needed to be silently eliminated to protect the secrecy and success of the broader operation, and Wake, drawing on her Special Operations Executive unarmed combat training, personally killed the sentry using her bare hands. A genuinely extraordinary detail that Wake herself, in later interviews, reportedly discussed with a matter-of-fact directness that reflected both her own remarkable personal character and the genuinely brutal life-or-death realities that resistance operatives like herself confronted on a regular basis throughout their wartime service. Perhaps the single most physically demanding individual feat of Wake's entire wartime service came following a German attack on her resistance group's operational base, an assault that resulted in the destruction of the group's radio equipment and codebooks, materials that were absolutely essential for maintaining secure communication with British intelligence and coordinating the ongoing resistance operations in the region. With these critical communication capabilities destroyed and no other immediately available means of re-establishing contact, Wake made the extraordinary decision to personally cycle a distance of approximately 500 kilometers, roughly 310 miles, across occupied French territory, moving through multiple German checkpoints and control zones in order to reach a location where she could obtain replacement codes and re-establish the communication link her resistance group desperately needed to continue receiving Allied support and coordination. This extraordinary journey, undertaken largely without rest across a period of several days, required Wake to maintain her operational cover throughout an enormously demanding physical ordeal, passing through German-controlled checkpoints and populated areas, while suffering from the genuine physical exhaustion such a sustained cycling effort would naturally produce. All while remaining constantly alert to the very real danger that any moment of carelessness or bad fortune could result in her capture by German or collaborationist forces, actively searching for exactly the kind of resistance operative Wake represented. Upon successfully completing this journey and obtaining the necessary replacement communication materials, Wake then made the return journey as well, completing what amounted to an extraordinary round-trip cycling effort of roughly 1,000 kilometers under genuinely hostile, dangerous conditions. An achievement that, considered purely as a feat of physical endurance, would have been remarkable, even without the additional layer of extreme danger and operational stress under which it was actually accomplished. Wake's resistance forces, under her coordination and that of her fellow Special Operations executive colleagues operating in the region, played a significant role in disrupting German military capability in the area throughout the critical weeks surrounding the Normandy invasion, engaging in sustained guerrilla warfare against German forces. Conducting sabotage operations against transportation infrastructure and communication lines, and generally contributing to the broader Allied strategic objective of preventing German forces from efficiently reinforcing their positions in Normandy in response to the Allied invasion. Work that historians have generally credited as making a genuine, meaningful contribution to the broader success of the Allied invasion effort during this critical period of the war. German and collaborationist French forces continued to actively hunt for Wake throughout this period, aware that a highly capable Allied resistance coordinator was operating within the region and responsible for a substantial portion of the disruption their forces were experiencing. But Wake's combination of operational skill, genuine physical capability, and, by her own later account, a considerable degree of simple fortune allowed her to continue evading capture throughout the remainder of the war, surviving numerous close encounters with German search operations and checkpoints. That, under only slightly different circumstances, could easily have resulted in her capture, and, given the nature of her activities, almost certain execution, had German forces succeeded in identifying and apprehending her. Following the war's end, Wake's extraordinary wartime service was recognized through numerous significant military honors from multiple Allied nations, reflecting both the genuine operational significance of her contributions and the remarkable, well-documented nature of her individual wartime exploits. She received the George Medal from Britain, one of the country's highest civilian honors for bravery, the United States Medal of Freedom, and several of France's most significant military honors, including the Croix de Guerre with Palm, and later, considerably later in her life, France's highest honor, the Legion of Honor. Recognition that reflected the genuine, lasting French appreciation for the significant contribution Wake had made to resistance operations within their own occupied territory during the war's most critical final years. In the decades following the war, Wake continued to lead a genuinely eventful, independent life, including a period of involvement in Australian politics, where she ran unsuccessfully for political office on several occasions, before eventually settling into a quieter later life. Though she remained, throughout these subsequent decades, remarkably candid and forthcoming in interviews and public appearances regarding her wartime experiences, offering historians and journalists genuine, detailed first-hand accounts of resistance operations that might otherwise have remained considerably less well documented. Given how many of her fellow resistance operatives, for various reasons, chose to remain considerably more private regarding their own wartime activities in the years following the war's end. Wake's own later reflections on her wartime service consistently emphasized a straightforward, unsentimental practicality regarding the genuinely violent and dangerous actions her resistance work had required, famously remarking, in various interviews conducted later in her life, that she had never particularly regretted the more violent aspects of her wartime service, including the direct killing of enemy personnel that her work had, on occasion, required, framing these actions within the straightforward context of a war in which the enemy she and her fellow resistance operatives faced represented a genuine existential threat that justified whatever measures proved necessary to resist it effectively. Nancy Wake passed away in 2011 at the age of 98, having lived to become one of the most celebrated, publicly recognized female resistance operatives of the entire Second World War, her wartime story having gradually gained increasing public recognition and historical attention in the decades following the war. As growing scholarly and popular interest in the broader, historically underappreciated contributions of women to Allied resistance and intelligence operations helped from figures like Wake the kind of sustained public recognition that had often eluded many resistance operatives of any gender in the more immediate post-war decades. What makes Wake's story particularly remarkable, beyond the sheer scale and danger of her individual wartime exploits, is the genuine, sustained physical courage and operational capabilities she demonstrated across years of extraordinarily dangerous work, activities that required not simply a single moment of dramatic heroism, but a sustained, years-long willingness to accept enormous personal risk repeatedly in service of a cause she had come to believe in with genuine, deeply held personal conviction, long before most of the wider world had fully grasped the true scale of what Nazi Germany actually represented. Her story stands as a powerful reminder that some of the Second World War's most extraordinary individual contributions came not from conventional military figures operating within traditional command structures, but from individuals like Wake, whose particular combination of personal conviction, physical capability, and genuine operational skill allowed them to make contributions to the Allied war effort that, in Wake's specific case, German intelligence services found themselves entirely unable to prevent or effectively counter. Despite years of dedicated, well-resourced effort specifically directed toward identifying and capturing the elusive operative they knew only as the White Mouse. This has been Forgotten Frontlines. Every story we bring you is researched, written, and brought to life by the V-Team, because some battles deserve to be remembered, no matter how strange, no matter how forgotten.
If this story moved you, like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more forgotten stories from the front lines of the past. We'll see you in the next one.